First of all, introductions. I'm Mary Aileen Buss. I'm one of the librarians here at the Long Beach Library. And what I'm going to be showing you today is making a fuzzy miniature heart pillow out of fur fabric. I've been doing fur fabric for more than 20 years now, so I've gotten pretty good at this. So let me move the webcam over so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so what we're doing today is making a heart pillow. Nice little fuzzy thing. It's about 5 or 6 inches across. You can do it in regular fabrics too. I did this on the sewing machine, just quilting cotton. But you start with the fur fabric. You need 2 sides, front and back. And I've got one piece cut out already. It's a heart shape with a couple of little bites out of the top to be darts to give it some shape. And I'm going to show you how to cut the other one. This is the pattern. This is template plastic. They sell it for quilting. It's great for patterns of all kinds because if you trace around it multiple times, the edges don't fray. And if you've got markings on it, it's much easier to transfer to your fabric because you can see it for both sides. You can use thin cardboard. Oak tag, poster board works really well. That thin cardboard that comes inside shirts sometimes, anything like that. The cardboard will fray around the edges a little if you use the pattern repeatedly. So you notice I've got an arrow on the pattern. That's to show which way I want the nap of the fur to go. So my first step is I have to confirm that I've got the nap of the fur going in the right direction. You can stroke it down and it's smooth. If you ruffle it back up, then that would be the wrong way around. So I confirm which direction the fur is going, and I put the heart down the same way. Now this pattern is symmetrical, so it doesn't matter if I flip the heart over for the second piece or not. Here, let me move this back a little more, you can see better. So to trace around it, you need something that can make a line on the fabric with minimal pressure. The best thing I've found for that is gel pens. Something like a Sharpie will work if the fabric's light enough. But if you're using a black or dark brown fabric, black Sharpie ain't gonna show, and neither will like a yellow one because it doesn't have that brightness, it just melts in. The gel pens will have that brightness. So I hold the pattern down and I trace carefully around it, all the way around it. Sometimes with a bigger piece, maybe even with this one, you have to sort of shift your grip a little bit to finish tracing and make sure that your pattern piece didn't shift while you do it. And I've got a couple of little dots on here. I'm going to put those on there. That's where I'm going to leave it open to cut. Now I see we've got somebody else waiting, so we'll give it one moment. For her to get in. Got a couple of people. Okay, so, and then the next thing, this in some ways is the hardest part, is cutting out the fur. What you want to do is just cut the backing and not the fur itself. There's 2 reasons for that. One is if you cut the fur itself, you get fluff everywhere. You're going to get fluff everywhere anyway, but you want to minimize it. The other reason is that you want it to be able to hang down and be hanging down off the edge on your finished thing to cover the seams. So if you have something really sharp, like an X-Acto knife or woodcutter or something that's really, really sharp, you can just carefully cut around the line you've just drawn. I don't have anything that sharp. So what you usually have to do is you take your fabric scissors and you sort of slide them in under the fur to just cut the fabric. You've got to go slow and careful so you don't mess up. And it takes practice. And like I said, I've been doing this for more than 20 years, and I still mess up if I'm not slow and careful. So I'm just going to cut around. It might be easier if I had scissors with a thinner bottom blade, but these are my good fabric scissors and they're the ones I use. You need something sharp for fabric. If you're ever going to sew, get a pair of decent fabric scissors. They don't have to be really high-end, but decent. And don't use them for anything else. You use fabric scissors on paper, you'll kill the edge. Now you notice I did pretty well here. Most of the fur is still on the piece that I cut off there. But I'm not finished. I got to go the rest of the way around. Slow and careful. There we have our second half. You notice I didn't completely succeed in not cutting the fabric because I got little tufts here to throw out. They'll just get tracked all over the apartment later, but okay. So the first thing we need to do is sew up the darts. So I'm going to pinch one together, making sure that the fur pile stays out of the seam. And this is small enough that I don't even use a pin in it. You can if you want to. Oops, wait. First, I have to put some thread in the needle. That always helps when you're sewing. Oops. So, now this is actually quilting thread. I like it because it's fairly sturdy and I have it around for the quilting anyway. You can use normal thread, it's fine. And I usually do single strand. If you're more comfortable with double strand, that absolutely works. So pinch the dart together, make sure the fur doesn't get caught in it. And the needle I have here is actually an embroidery needle. I like them because they have nice big eyes, makes them easier to thread. But again, any ordinary sewing needle will work. And I just stitch it up. You need to go back and forth. Can you see this? Yeah, I'm out of the way. You need to go back and forth, not around and around over the edge. If you go around and around over the edge, when you turn it right side out, the edges will, the seams will sort of pop and you'll have your raw edges showing. And that's not what you want. Now you might wonder why I'm hand sewing this instead of machine sewing it. There's two reasons for that. One is I don't have any way to get the sewing machine and the computer next to each other. But in actual fact, I sew fur fabric by hand anyway. Something like this is all flat seams. It would work fairly well on a machine, but it's easier to keep the fur out of the seam if you do it by hand. And if you're making a stuffed animal, three-dimensional with arms and legs and noses and things, you're going to have some three-dimensional curved seams where you're matching two different curves. And to do that on the machine, you'd have to baste it by hand first anyway to hold it in place. So I'd rather just go ahead and sew the thing. So I have to sew up all four of these darts. If one of my coworkers wants to unmute while I'm doing this, if anybody has any questions, because just watching somebody sew is not the most exciting thing in the world.
Mary Aileen, where do you get
Yeah.
that plastic pattern thing?
The pattern? Oh, I made the pattern. Or do
No,
you mean where did I get the plastic?
Yeah.
The plastic, I get it at Joann's.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not that expensive. Maybe $1.50 for a piece as big as the little tray table I have here.
Now, why do you put the darts in? I've never done a thing like that and thought of putting darts in.
The darts are to give it a little bit more shape. instead of just being flat and the stuffing giving it the shape. If you'll
Yeah.
notice on this other one, it's pretty rounded here. That's because it's got the darts in the top.
Oh.
You could do it just flat. When I was a kid, I made some really simple stuffed animals and they were just flat. The only shape they had to them were from the stuffing. But the darts give it a little more shape.
Wow.
Yeah, it's the
I
little
would never.
things.
Mhm.
But you know, if you wanted to make a heart pillow like this and just draw out a heart and do it without the darts, it would come out pretty well.
Mhm. Mm.
And it's a pretty simple pattern to make. I literally drew out half a heart and flipped it over to make the other half so it would be symmetrical. But if somebody wants a copy of my pattern, you can throw your email in the chat here and I'll email you the pattern later. Might be tomorrow. I'm not sure I have one that's in the computer ready to email, but. Okay, we got more people coming in. So let me just finish this dart, last dart, and I'll recap a little bit. I'm making a fuzzy little heart pillow out of fur fabric. I drew out the pattern on template plastic, which I'll show you in a moment. You can use thin cardboard like poster board or oak tag, works just fine. And you lay out your pattern, making sure you're getting the grain of the fur right. Now, if you get a commercial pattern from somewhere, either buying one or you're copying it out of a book, it's already going to have arrows in it for which way the fur should go. If you're making your own pattern, whether simple or elaborate, you have to figure out which way you want the fur to go. And then just lay the pieces out right. So here's the pattern for those who came in late. And I've got a little arrow showing that I want the fur to go down from the top to the bottom. So if you smooth it down, it goes that way. If we ruffle
Could you hold
it back.
it a little bit further to the right, Mary
Sorry,
Aileen?
I keep holding them too far over from where I'm sitting.
There we
If I
go. Thank
ruffle
you.
it, if I stroke it up, it ruffles, but we want it smoothed down from top to bottom. So I've got the two identical halves, and now I need to put them together. And I'm going to line up the darts carefully and pin them. I'm using long pins with a round head. They need to be long because the fur pile makes it thick, and the round head makes it so you don't lose the head of the pin when you're trying to pull it back out again. And I didn't finish talking about cutting it out. So you lay you figure out which way your fur goes, and you lay the pattern down and hold it in place while you trace around it with a gel pen works best. You can use a Sharpie if the fabric's light enough to show up, but you need something that's going to make a good bold line with that minimal pressure, because the fur cushions it, pads it, so you can't really put much pressure on because it's all padded. And I make sure the points are lined up. And while I'm pinning it, I'm trying to get the fur as much as possible tucked inside the seam, because you don't want the fur to be caught in the seam. And also, I made a couple of dots. There were a couple of dots on the pattern on the side, and I made a couple here. That's so I can leave that open so that I can turn it right side out. when I've finished sewing it. If you sew it all the way around without leaving an opening, then that's your pillow with the fur on the inside. And that's not what you want to do. Put one more pin in to hold it. Okay, and then I just start sewing around. I hand sew these because it's easier to keep the fur inside instead of in the seam. And also because if you've got something more elaborate that's three-dimensional, those three-dimensional seams need to be at least basted by hand. This is nice and flat. You could do a heart like this on a machine without too much trouble. Then you'd have your some of the fur caught. You can do something about that, but the less caught it is, the easier it makes it. And I'm going back and forth, not around and around. Okay. And this goes on for a little while because I got to sew all the way around except for the hole. So if my coworkers want to unmute and anybody has any questions, maybe one of you who came in later and missed a bit wants me to go over something.
I think it's great that you're hand sewing it. I would never be able to do that.
Yeah, it's not that hard. It's
So
basic.
you're doing it so fast. It would take me all because you're doing them so close together.
Yeah, I've been doing it a long time. Practice makes perfect.
So you don't have to wear thimbles anymore. Is that what they call
No,
them?
well, this is pretty soft. I've got a thimble for when I'm working with fabric that's more resistant, like one of the suede cloths that I do sometimes. But this fur, it's fur fabric has either a knit or woven backing. The inexpensive ones like this is a knit backing, and basically your needle sort of slides in between the threads. It's not like it's a solid piece.
Mary Aileen, you said you use a pin with a longer pin with a round head. Do they sell those?
Oh yeah. I'm not sure where these came from. My mother gave them to me when I first started doing stuffed animals, but you can get pins like this, very similar at Joann's, or I'm not sure if Michael's would carry them, but any fabric store would have these.
Mm-hmm.
Joann's is almost the last one standing.
Around here, yeah, unless you want to go into the city, into the fabric district. Michael's has a few things, but you can't get this fabric here. You can get fur fabric like this at Joann's too. But
I think one time all the way out to West, are they in West Islip?
Westbury, Old Country Road, yeah, just past Eisenhower Park.
But the other one's way out east. I had to go there for handles for a crochet project.
Yeah, there's several on the island. I know there's one in, I think it's Holbrook. And there may be one in Bayshore.
Yeah.
A friend of mine lives out in Patchogue, and she has a Joann's pretty close to her, but I'm not sure exactly what town it's in.
So you didn't turn it over. You're doing the wrong sides now, right?
Yeah, you put the right sides together, the two first sides together, and you sew from the back. And when I've got the seam all the way around, I'll turn it right side out through the hole I'm leaving. If I was making this out of felt or fleece or something, it wouldn't matter if I didn't turn it. I could just leave the little raw edge because it's not a raw edge. It looks just like everything else. It would give a different look than if you turned it right side out, but it would be fine. For anything else, you're going to want to sew it inside out with the right sides together and then turn it after. But even if you're doing this in felt or fleece and you're just going to leave the edge and not turn it, you still have to leave a hole so you can stuff it.
Yeah.
I'm almost halfway around already.
I remember my mom always said the key to sewing is sharp scissors and an iron and a
Yeah.
good iron.
Yeah, you don't want to use an iron on this. I mean, this is acrylic, but it doesn't wrinkle like, say, cottonwood either. But yeah, you do want good scissors. And you notice I've got two pairs here. I've got the big fabric scissors that I used, and then I've got the little thread scissors. You can manage with just one if you're only doing small projects, but it's really awkward to cut thread with the big scissors. And if you're cutting a big thing out of fabric, it's really hard to do it with a small scissors. But you do want to buy some decent scissors and only use them for fabric. Never use your fabric scissors on paper. Paper kills the edge. Don't use them to cut your hair either. If you're sick of your hair and your eyes,
Can you use them on,
what's that?
can you use them on the yarn or no?
Yeah, they're fine on yarn. Yarn is basically fabric. It's all fiber. And I'm going to have to change this thread pretty soon. Got a little ways yet, but not enough to get all the way around.
Now you said you use a certain kind of thread?
This is a thread that's designed for hand quilting.
Oh, okay.
It's a little bit stiffer and sturdier than your ordinary thread.
Mhm.
If I didn't already have quilting thread because I quilt, I wouldn't bother buying it. I would just use the ordinary stuff. But since I have it, I go ahead and use it for the stuffed animals. And the needle I'm using is an embroidery needle. I like them better than the regular. I use them because they have nice big eyes, relatively speaking. Makes them easier to thread. But any basic sewing needle is just fine for this.
You know, do you recall doing curves and having to cut into the thing all the way around because it's a curve?
Oh, I see. Yeah, matching two curves like that, and then you have to snip it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not important for this,
Okay.
but it is a thing to do. Even with the cotton, I didn't have to because the curves are the same shape. But also the fur fabric, the backing is flexible enough, and it's a pretty narrow seam here. You don't want to do more than a 1/4 inch seam.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you're snipping, you got to be careful not to snip through the
Snip in through the seam. Yeah, it's a problem. Now I should have told you how I was tying that off. I'll try to remember to do it when I get around to the far end of this seam. I've been doing it several times and not talking about it. It's
No, do you ever use fabric glue? I've always wondered what people use that for.
I haven't, no. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, I'm not.
Maybe it's for knitting and crocheting.
Some people might use it for applique, or you can use it if you're just making a costume or something that's going to be worn once and maybe seen from a distance, and it doesn't really matter if you have the fine finishing details. I know you can use hot glue gun for that. The felting I was doing, what was it, a month ago? You could use fabric glue for that instead of the hot glue I was doing.
Oh, what with the Star Wars?
The Star Wars, yeah, the little felt figures. Okay, so I'm almost done. You see where this blue pin is? That's pretty much the end of this seam. And you may notice I'm taking the pins out as I go. It just makes it easier. You don't need them anymore, and they're long and bulky and in the way. Now, if you'll remember, the fur was hanging down past the point a little, and I've got it all brushed inside. This fur is fairly well behaved. Some of the softer ones in particular, bits and pieces of it will try to escape as you're sewing, and you can just stuff them back in with the side of your needle. I've been doing it sort of subconsciously without even thinking about it. And just, as I said a bit earlier, if you have some fur caught in the seam, there's something you can do about it at the end. But the less fur you have caught, the easier it's going to be at the end. So about another inch to that other dot. And then I will stuff it back in with your finger too, if you have to. If I start drifting too far over and holding this where you can't see, somebody yell at me, because I sort of subconsciously do that, and I do apologize. It's because I'm trying to half face the screen as well as the. Okay, so for tying it off, for my last stitch, next to last stitch, I don't pull the thread all the way through. I leave a loop here, and then I come back up and I run my needle in through that loop a couple of times. And then when I pull it tight, that makes a knot. And then I just run the needle in through the edge of the seam a little bit to anchor the end of the thread and cut it off. And I always make the knot for the next thread before I put the needle down. Okay, so we've got this sewn all the way around except for a hole. And then we just turn it right side out. You need to make the hole, leave the hole big enough that you can turn it easily, but small enough that you don't have too much to close afterwards. Now this one worked pretty well, but if you've got something bigger or with long skinny things, this is a chopstick. They work really well for making sure you got your points sticking out and everything. So you notice, Robin, you were asking about the darts. You can see this has a little bit of shape to the top, and I haven't even stuffed it yet. So that's why the stuffing. This is polyester fiber fill. I got this at Michael's. Joann's carries it. It's about $6 for this big bag. Lasts forever. If you don't want to use stuffing, if you're making one tiny project and don't want to buy a whole big bag, wadded up nylon stockings work really well. Old nylon stockings, you wad them up so they're springy. Cotton balls would probably work. Odds and ends of scrap yarn would probably work. But the ones I made when I was a kid, we used old stockings. So this, it's fluff, and you can pull it apart, and you just put it in through the hole and try to get it into the corners. You want to use fairly small pieces at a time so that you can shift it around. Sorry about that, I'm going down too low. Let me pull a little more out. And if necessary, we can use the chopstick to get that positioned well. This is where it can be helpful to have small hands. Sometimes with a stuffed animal, I wind up with my hand up past my wrist into the animal to get the stuffing in. And I meant to bring one of mine over to show you, but I think all the ones in this room now are ones that I bought instead. So we just stuff it. You can stuff it more or less depending on how firm you want it to be. And I need to make sure to get some in this tip down here so that it holds its shape. And as you go, yeah, this doesn't have quite enough yet. So you keep pulling wads off and putting them into the empty spaces. And yeah, that's about right. I don't need a little bit more, tiny bit more. And you make sure you get all the ends of that stuffed in so they're not holding. Yep, that's good. Put this back in, get it out of my way. And now we get to close up the gap. Now I'm using red thread on this. You want to match the thread to your project if you can. But for most of it, if you do it right, the seam doesn't show. All the stitches are hidden inside the fur. This bit is where things sometimes will show a little bit. Now for this, we use either a ladder stitch, or I like to use a stitch that's kind of like lacing up a shoe. I put my needle down inside, come up from inside to start with, so that the knot is down inside the fur on one side, and then I go duck inside again and come up on the other side. The tricky bit is you have to have the edges sort of folded in so the raw edge doesn't show, and you have to make sure that you're catching the backing and not just the fur, because if your needle and thread are just catching the fur, your stitches are going to pull out. And you just keep doing that. You go from side to side. Every stitch starts inside and comes up to the outside. There's a number of different ways of lacing a shoe, but this is the basic way. Look at a pair of lace-up shoes sometime and you'll see what I mean. And we just keep going until we get the hole. A little bit left. Oh, this didn't take as long as I thought. And I don't have any more room to go inside, so I'm going to make one last stitch, just sort of looping around. And then with this loop, I'm going to run the needle in through a couple of times and pull it tight to knot. And now the end of this thread, I'm going to go down right next to where I came up and go in through the body of the thing and come up over here somewhere. And then I'm going to brush away the fur next to it. And I'm going to cut this as far down as I can without cutting any of the fur in the process. And it's the end of the thread is sort of hidden inside the body of the pillow. Now there's one more step before we're finished. And that is you look at the edges, particularly the seam you just did, and you see where there's any fur caught in the seam. There's always some. What you can do is you can take your needle or a pin and you scrub the tip sideways across where the fur is caught. And it should, if it's not very caught, it'll just come right out and you can smooth it down to hide the seam. Sometimes if it's gotten very caught, you'll sort of have to tease the pieces out one or two strands at a time, and that's incredibly tedious. But let's make sure I got the darts and everything all right in the middle. Little extra bit of fluff. Okay, there's a little bit here I didn't finish yet, and a little bit right there. Have to tease that out a little. And there we go. Okay, any questions, any comments?
I love it.
Thank you.
The darts really made it puffy.
Yeah, yeah, if it had just been flat, I mean, you can see this end doesn't have any darts and it's still kind of puffy between the fur and the stuffing, but with the darts, it really got rounded at the top. And you can do it with ordinary fabric. This is the same pattern, quilting cotton. I did it on the sewing machine. You can sort of see the seams and the darts a little better because they're not hidden in the fur, but it's the same basic idea.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody else with any questions?
You got that fur at, where did you get that fur material?
Joann's carries the fur fabric. I think I might have bought this online, but you can definitely get fur fabric at Joann's.
I like that.
It's easier to find in the fall and winter than this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
They have a bigger selection, but they have it year round.
Yeah.
I love it.
What else can you make with the fur that you've made? Like other
Mostly
shapes?
I do stuffed animals.
Oh,
If you'd like to wait a minute, I'll go get
Yeah.
that one. Right. Okay, so this stuffed cat here, the
wow.
one I made. Now
You
this
made
would
pattern, Mary Eileen?
what's that?
You make your own patterns?
No, no.
Okay.
I've made a few, sort of modifying. This is a big
Oh,
black
that's
squirrel.
cute. Wow.
Yeah, but I've done a few animal patterns, but mostly it's either using ones that I've found in books or bought, or modifying those. There's only so many ways a leg can go on. So
Oh, you do all the
All by
body parts?
hand?
what's that, Julie?
You stitch it all by hand? though?
I stitch them all by hand. Yeah.
Wow.
You know, something like this squirrel, you're putting the front piece together with the side piece, and that's not a very smooth curve. You wouldn't be able to lay that out on a machine without pinning the heck out of it, or basting it by hand first anyway. So it's easier just to sew by hand, I find.
Oh, like rough estimate, how long do you think something like that took you? Like the squirrel, for instance.
The squirrel took me
It's probably hard because you probably
10 or
did it.
12 hours, I think.
Ooh, yeah, that's amazing though.
Yeah.
Looks so good.
Wow. So you're busy.
Yeah, it's my main hobby. Okay, so I think that's it for today, unless there's any more questions or.
Thank you so much. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Have a good day.
Yep.
Bye.